Hi, I'm Dave Hess, and I am so glad that you can join us for this first class addressing the issue of critical race theory. And tonight you're going to hear the history of critical race theory, some of the philosophies that have influenced it through the years, and you're also going to see how critical race theory contrasts with a biblical worldview. Anna Marie Dandy, an elder here at Christ Community Church, and Bob Baynard, another elder here at the church and pastor on our team, will be teaching. You will so appreciate their insights tonight. And I want to pray for you as we approach this subject, because Paul, 2,000 years ago, addressed this issue. He said to the Colossians 2, verse 8, "See to it, be on your guard, be alert, see to it that no one takes you captive through godless or empty philosophies." The word for empty means without hope and without God, and critical race theory is such a worldview. While appearing to address the issue of racism, it actually creates more racial divide. Why? Because it is a hopeless approach to life, and it's a godless approach to life. So in this hour, God wants us to know how to discern, but also how to respond, because many in our culture right now are being captivated by this view of life. So let me pray for you as we begin our time. Father, thank you that you are the only wise God. Thank you that you've sent the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, to lead us into all truth. Jesus, we honor you as the way, the truth, and the life. And so we ask that you would bring a revelation of your view of the world, your view of life, and that we would see through your eyes the way the world is in your heart. We would see people through your eyes. We would look redemptively, faithfully, with a heart full of faith, and hopefully at all that you are doing and will do in our day to bring your kingdom to this world. So I bless my friends as they listen. Let us receive fresh revelation from you. So join me in welcoming Anna Marie Dandy as she shares her heart with you tonight. God bless you.
So this month, we're digging into some cultural issues that are affecting church bodies, schools and universities, government, and virtually every aspect of our lives, namely critical race theory. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, critical race theory, CRT, is an intellectual movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of humans, but a socially constructed category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. Critical race theorists believe that the law and legal institutions in the U.S. were made to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites. So the basic idea is that the laws of our nation were created to benefit white people alone, and for them to maintain their control and power, and for those who were powerless to remain powerless. As an introduction, I want to start with the idea of worldview, because CRT is not just a theory, but it's also a worldview. A worldview is the overall perspective from which a person sees and interprets the world. It is the lens from which you interpret all data that comes through your senses and includes things like your culture, your upbringing, education, your physical location, peer groups, as well as really anything you encounter on a day-to-day basis. It's how you view the world. And race is the lens that CRT views the entire world. As believers, we should have a biblical worldview, where the lens that we view everything around us is from a kingdom and biblical perspective, which sees Jesus as the hope for all people everywhere. It's hugely important as Christians that we learn to have a biblical worldview and that we are teaching our people and our families to have a biblical worldview so that the lens from which we are viewing and interpreting everything we take in is from a kingdom or biblical perspective. If not, people are left to come up with their own versions of what truth and reality are. We know that Jesus is the truth. In order for us to interpret the world like he does, we need to be connected to him and his word. In order for us to know the truth, we must know the truth with a capital T, Jesus. The national survey group Barna has done extensive research into the worldview of self-proclaimed Christians. It was called the most sophisticated nationwide survey of worldview that was ever conducted in the U.S. In it, they found that although 7 out of 10 Americans consider themselves Christian, just 6% actually possess a biblical worldview. The number of American adults holding a biblical worldview has declined by over 50% in the past 25 years. The survey found that only 2% of those 18 to 29-year-olds possess a biblical worldview. This should be alarming. The lack of a biblical worldview among Christians is largely because even though most Americans identify as Christians, biblical illiteracy is running rampant. After the pandemic, Barna did another survey asking how many Christians read their Bible every day. They were asked how often the participant personally reads the Bible on their own. That is, when they're not at a church service or at a Bible study. Only 9% of Christians said that they read their Bibles every day, the lowest figure in the past 10 years. 34% say they never read their Bibles. We cannot expect our people to have a biblical worldview if they don't know or read their Bibles. Hearing a few scriptures once or twice a week at a church service or Bible study, while important, is not enough to build a biblical worldview when everything else around is screaming a secular, cultural worldview. If someone is not actively pursuing having a biblical worldview, they'll still have a worldview. It will just be dictated by the culture, which is why the worldview of critical race theory has become so pervasive in our country. Unfortunately, the worldview of CRT is creeping into our churches, our schools, our jobs, and pretty much every area of our lives. We need to be aware of it and war against it. CRT filters every aspect of life through the lens of race, where one race is the oppressor, the white race, and the other race is the oppressed, the black race. And there is no hope to escape the guilt of being the oppressor or escaping the victimhood of the oppressed. So if you're white, you're eternally guilty of racism, and if you're black, there is no escape into a better place in our nation. For example, imagine a scenario where a young white male and a young black male walk in a store together and they start walking around and shopping. They are virtually identical in every way, from their dress to their mannerisms. The only thing different about them is the color of their skin. If the clerk goes to help the young black man first, CRT will say that it's racist because the clerk automatically distrusts the black person and wants to keep an eye on him and quickly get him out of the store. If the clerk helps the white man first, CRT would say that's racist because the clerk is valuing the white young man more than the black man. In CRT, everything is racist, and there are no other possible explanations. In CRT, only the white race can be racist. In a biblical worldview, any person can prejudge someone negatively by race, but also anyone can be forgiven and move past this sin. But how did we get here? Let me explain a little bit about the origins of this worldview. Over the course of history, our nation, there have been 3 prominent worldviews. The pre-modern worldview was up through the 17th century, and it viewed reality as both supernatural and physical. So they believed in like angels and spirits, but also the material world. The supreme authority was God and the Ten Commandments. Then in the 18th century, through part of the 20th century, we had the worldview of modernism, where the only reality was what you could see in the physical realm. Scientific thought governed the day. Then from the latter half of the 20th century, and up until now, we have what is called the postmodern worldview, where the human mind is the source of reality. Idealism had a great influence in the 19th and 20th century. Idealism is this philosophy that believes the ultimate nature of reality is ideal or based upon your ideas or values. Idealistic philosophers like Nietzsche, Kant, and others greatly influenced the thought of this age. And it was into this world that came Karl Marx and his communist philosophy. In order to understand where critical race theory comes from, it helps to begin with a brief history of Marxism. Originally, Marx built his political ideas on the theory of class conflict. Marx believed that the main problems of industrial societies was an imbalance of power between the capitalist wealthy business owners and the much poorer workers. The solution to that imbalance, according to Marx, was revolution. And these were the ideas in his Communist Manifesto, which was written in 1848. Most of the masses failed to arise in revolution, though. So in the late 1920s and early 1930s, those who believed in Marxism gradually started to gather together to figure out why the workers never revolted and why capitalism was doing so well. This group and their discussions came to be known as the Frankfurt School because they were meeting in Frankfurt, Germany. They decided, instead of focusing on economics, that the problem with disparities between the groups of people was the culture. So they looked to there for ways to encourage the revolution. This became known as critical theory. Critical theory is defined as a Marxist-inspired movement in social and political philosophy originally associated with the Frankfurt School. Drawing particularly on the thought of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud, critical theorists maintain that a primary goal of the philosophy is to understand and help overcome the social structures through which the people are dominated and oppressed. Eventually, communism did begin taking off in places like Russia, Cambodia, China, and Vietnam, where there was vast economic differences between the ruling class and the poor. But it wasn't gaining ground everywhere, and communists were still actively pursuing their goals of a communist worldwide revolution. In the early 1960s, U.S. intelligence obtained a list of 45 goals that communist international leaders intended to carry out in order to destroy Western civilization, America, and Christianity. In 1963, Congressman A.S. Herlong Jr. of Florida read this list into the congressional record in an attempt to warn America about the dangers of this movement. All 43 are worth reading, but I'm just going to highlight a few. You can easily find them online if you want to see the whole list. So, the communists plan to capture one or both of the political parties in the United States, use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights. They wanted to get control of the schools and use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. They wanted to soften the curriculum, dumb down our children, get control of teachers' associations, and put the party line into textbooks. They wanted to infiltrate the press, gain control of positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. They wanted to eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. They wanted to break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. They wanted to present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. They plan to infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with a social religion. They wanted to eliminate prayer and any phase of religious expression in the schools on the ground that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. They plan to discredit the American Constitution and discredit the Founding Fathers. They wanted to belittle all forms of American culture and discourage the teaching of American history, focusing more on the big picture. They wanted to infiltrate and gain control of big business, transfer some of the powers of arrest from the police to social agencies, discredit the family as an institution, encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. And they plan to emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. That whole idea of it takes a village. So, by the mid-1960s, Marxists in the West had begun to acknowledge many of the failures that communism and there were vast amounts of destruction of human life and poor economies that communism brought about. So they again began looking to the culture and critical theory. They also came to realize that the workers' revolutions that they hoped for weren't going to happen in Western Europe or America, where there was a large middle class and a rapidly improving standards of living. They simply found it too difficult to stir up the masses against virtually non-existent classes. So they adapted their revolutionary theory to the social and racial unrest of the 1960s. They substituted race for class and sought to bring about a revolution based on racial and ethnic categories instead of the worker versus capitalism, which is where critical race theory had its birth, and its link to Marxism is inextricable. The actual term critical race theory was first used in our American universities in the 1990s. For many years, it was only found in obscure academic journals, but over the past decade, it has become increasingly prominent ideology in our public institutions. It has been injected into government agencies, public school systems, teacher training programs, and corporate human resource departments, in the forms of things like diversity training programs, human resource modules, public policy frameworks, and school curriculum. Critical race theorists realized that using the term neo-Marxism would be a hard sell, so they decided to use language to their benefit and confusion of others. They used terms like equity, which sounds non-threatening and is easily confused with the American principle of equality. Understanding the differences between these two words is hugely important in understanding the CRT worldview. Equality is what we think of as in all men are created equal, meaning that they have equal value before God regardless of the color of skin. It is the principle that our founding documents put forth. It was made into law with the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Equality, though, is explicitly rejected by critical race theorists. To them, equality represents mere non-discrimination and provides camouflage for white supremacy, patriarchy, and oppression. As you can see, much of the Marxist communist agenda has been accomplished right under our noses with little resistance from anyone. We are seeing it lived out today through the Marxist organization Black Lives Matter and those pushing CRT. So Marxism and CRT are close cousins, if not synonymous. Another key concept of CRT is intersectionality. Intersectionality is defined as the theory that the overlap of various social identities, such as race, gender, sexuality, and class, contributes to the specific type of systemic oppression and discrimination experienced by an individual. So, a black cisgender male, cisgender just means you're attracted to the opposite sex, a black cisgender male is less oppressed than a black female lesbian. The more the intersections, the more the oppression. A white, heterosexual male Christian is considered the ultimate oppressor. Critical race theory also breeds hatred for America because it teaches the belief that the founding of our nation was only for racist reasons, so that every system in our society supposedly has racist roots, from the highway system to suburbs, to grammar and math, to a good work ethics, to being on time, to the roots of our law enforcement system, to almost anything that most people would consider a normal part of a society. It's now coming under question as being racist. America is considered as being unforgivably racist. Prager University recently went onto campuses asking university students some very basic questions about American history. They talked to regular students as well as those majoring in history. Many of them could not answer basic American history questions, like who was the first president, when was the Declaration of Independence written, etc. Even the history majors. The American history that many of us learned when we were in schools is no longer being taught. Civics, the study of American government, is no longer required in schools. So in 2016, which was the last time this survey was taken, only 18% of 8th graders could name all 3 branches of government, and they could not explain anything about our Constitution. We have a generation of young people who do not know true American history, the good and the bad, and they do not know what rights they have under the Constitution. Yet, at the same time, it is many from this generation who have bought into the lies of socialism and Marxism and CRT because that is what they are being taught. Many also believe the false narrative that America was founded as a racist nation. There are racists still in America, and America does have racism in the past. And yes, there are racists still today. You can't ignore the truth of our past. But we also need to acknowledge how far we have come in this regard as a nation. And the statistics, laws, and the behavior of the vast majority of modern-day Americans back this up. All you have to do is look around you and you can see that we are no longer a nation of slavery, sharecroppers, and forced segregation. Many have fought long and hard, both whites and blacks, to change the laws and the wrongs of the past. Unjust laws have been rewritten. Jim Crow laws of the South are no longer on the books, and there are laws against discrimination in hiring and discrimination in buying, leasing, and selling property. There is certainly more to be done, but we have made much progress, and people from around the world, when asked, actually acknowledge that we are actually one of the least racist nations in existence today. But was America founded upon racism with a desire to perpetuate it, as CRT would tell you? The Pulitzer Prize-winning 1619 Project would have you believe so. It was organized and paid for by the New York Times, and it re-examined the country's founding and legacy of slavery, considered the nation's founding in 1619, the year of the first black slave set foot in America. It won a Pulitzer Prize, even though historians, including many prominent black historians, agree that it is not factual in its presentation of our history, or even our black history. Even though that's the case, it was made into a curriculum and taught in many public schools. Even if that exact curriculum isn't taught, oftentimes the same narrative is. So let's look at some of the basic historical facts about our founding and what CRT says and what the facts are, and you can judge for yourself. First, people would like us to believe that it was basically the American culture that came up with slavery, that we didn't want to end it, and that because of this, all whites are inherently racist. You don't have to look very hard or think very strenuously to know this is wrong. Slavery has been around pretty much as long as people have been around. We have evidence of it in the Bible, in the very first book of Genesis, as well as all the way through the New Testament. This shows that slavery has been around and part of different cultures for millennia. Those were not white or Western cultures, as CRT would like you to believe. Our word slavery, or slave itself, comes from the word Slav, or the Slavic people of Eastern Europe. The Muslim and Ottoman Empire had conquered that region and took so many of their people captive, literally millions, and put them into forced labor that the word for their people, Slav, became synonymous with being a slave. So slavery is not an American concept, and it's not a white concept. Africans enslaved other Africans. Arabs enslaved the people they conquered. Native American tribes enslaved other tribes, and slavery still continues in some form in many places around the world today, including in Africa. One of the lower estimates of slavery in Africa today is 700,000 enslaved people. Slavery is a human sin problem that has been around for millennia and continues to this day. CRT says that because America was founded by Christians, that Christianity is racist and a white man's religion. They reason this because Paul, in the book of Colossians, gives instructions on how slaves should be treated by their owners and also how slaves should behave. Since the Bible doesn't specifically denounce slavery as evil, to them, that is God sanctioning slavery. In fact, it is true that many Southern pastors during the time of slavery would often use those exact words of Paul, along with other verses, to condone the behavior of them being slave owners. So is Christianity pro-slavery and offering only freedom to the white race? That statement isn't even logical. Paul said there was no Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, Jew nor Gentile in Christ Jesus. Paul was saying that in Jesus, even the most extreme cultural differences are nullified in Christ. So race is not the lens through which God, so then us, should be viewing the world. Jesus' teaching to love your neighbor as yourself is a direct confrontation of slavery. No one can lovingly enslave their neighbor. Christian teachings as a whole, when thought through, cannot be used to support the idea of slavery. In fact, it was Christianity's influence on Western culture and thinking, though arguably slow, that brought about the ideas of abolishing the evils of slavery, even though it had been around in every culture since the beginning of civilization. White Western culture ended slavery in their nations before all the other nations in the world. So, this brings us to the founding of our nation. Were all of the colonies founded with the desire to keep Africans enslaved? Was that the intent of our founding fathers? I can answer you assuredly no, even though that is not what is being taught. If you look into the first-person documentation, meaning the letters or writings from the actual people we're talking about, like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, you can see in their own words and get a true picture of what they really believed, instead of just reading what a current historian believes about them. So, can we agree that the culture at that time was very different? Those who only see the bad in our past are judging the people of that time by today's cultural standards, which makes very little sense. People are often complicated as well. Modern historians often want to assume motives, even though the Founding Fathers' own first-person words would contradict their opinions. Historians often attribute their own feelings into their writings. This is called presentism, and historians agree that it should not be used when evaluating the past. Unfortunately, that is what many of today's historians are actually doing. So let's look at some other claims about our history that CRT makes. CRT claims that our nation's foundation is racist. Is this true? There were white abolitionists' attempts to end slavery before the official formation of our nation. Pennsylvania was home to the first abolition movement. The very first was in 1688 when Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, wrote a 2-page condemnation of the practice and sent it to the governing bodies of their Quaker church. The Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage was the first abolitionist society in America and was formed in 1775, again primarily by the Quakers in Philadelphia. Rhode Island Quakers were among the very first to start actively going after and freeing slaves. So there have always been white Americans opposing slavery. So let's look at our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. CRT claims that it's a racist document. Let's look at the history. The original draft of the Declaration of Independence included portions that formally expressed the disapproval for the institution of slavery. The first draft was so anti-slavery that 2 colonies refused to sign it. The others thought that being united against the superpower of Great Britain was more important at the time than ending slavery, so it was rewritten with the hopes of addressing that issue at a later time. So even though Jefferson was a slaveholder, he himself knew what he meant when he said all men are created equal. He meant all men, blacks and whites. But for the sake of 2 colonies, South Carolina and Georgia, any mention of slavery was removed. But Jefferson made sure that the equality of all men was left in. CRT claims that the founding fathers were all racist because some of them were slaveholders. So let's look at 2 of their primary targets, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Prior to 1782, slaves could only be freed by the Virginia legislature due to some meritorious service of the slave. So if they were a hero of some kind. So it was against the law for a slave owner to free their slaves. So technically, Washington was not able to free his slaves even if he wanted to. George Washington inherited his first slaves. Later, he did buy some of his own, along with having more added when he married his wife. But despite being an active slaveholder for 56 years, George Washington in his writings struggled with the institution of slavery and spoke frequently of his desire to end the practice. And at the end of his life, Washington made the decision to free all his slaves in his 1799 will. He was the only slaveholding founding father to do so. Let's look at Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the one who wrote, "All men are created equal." And yet he enslaved more than 600 different people over the course of his lifetime. Although he made some legislative attempts against slavery and at times complained about its existence, he also profited directly from the institution of slavery. And he wrote that he suspected black people to be inferior to white people. But we also have to remember that the culture was different then, and that is what most people believed. Throughout his entire life, Jefferson was a publicly consistent opponent of slavery. He called it things like a moral depravity and a hideous blot. He believed that slavery presented the greatest threat to the survival of the new American nation. Jefferson also thought that slavery was contrary to the laws of nature, which decreed that everyone had the right to personal liberty. These views were radical in a world where unfree labor was the norm. As president, Jefferson signed the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slave, which took effect in 1808. So he was the one that signed into law the act that made it illegal for more slaves to be imported into our country. So, CRT also claims that the police system in the United States was started in order to catch runaway slaves. Is this true? Throughout history, there have always been law enforcement officials. As long as rulers have made laws, they have had people to enforce them. We see that in the Bible, that in Rome, where the Western culture came from, they had officials ensuring that the laws were followed. As well as we see in the Bible that the Pharisees and the Sadducees had people ensuring that the Jewish laws were followed. Each culture had people designated to enforce the ruler's laws. In England, the king developed what was called the Constable System. And at first, it was designed to uphold their right to reign as king and then to maintain public order. So our colonial police system was modeled after that. In the northern colonies, policing started with private citizens being night watchmen, and then eventually became more and more like the British constable system, like they were used to, with each community having a law enforcement person as needed. All the American colonies also had a sheriff system. The duties of the sheriff in those times were more expansive than our sheriffs of today. So then the sheriff collected taxes, supervised elections, and other things like that. So in the southern colonies, they also had sheriffs who dealt with law enforcement, but then also a special group was developed to catch runaway slaves, which was seen as enforcing the laws of slavery at the time. So the southern states did have law enforcers to catch runaway slaves, but that was not the origin and the root of our policing system. CRT also claims that our entire education system is built on racism, which is evidenced by the discrepancy today of test scores, the number of high school graduates, and school funding. So is this true? This one's a little more complicated, and there was racism present, especially in the South. At first in the colonies, there wasn't an official school. Each family taught their children at home. Many of the wealthy hired private tutors. Others just taught their children what they knew, often from the Bible. Gradually, towns and villages would gather children together for education as they saw fit. Before the 1830s, there was few restrictions on teaching slaves to read or write. Blacks in the North were always free to learn to read or write. There was still prejudice in the North, so getting an education if you were black was not always easy or accessible, but it was possible, and it did happen. After the slave revolt, led by Nat Turner in 1831, all the slave states, except for Maryland, Kentucky, and Tennessee, passed laws against teaching slaves to read and write. After the slaves were freed, it took a long time for things to get better. And we're aware of the segregation in schooling and elsewhere, where the quality of what was available for black schools and the ability to get higher education was often limited. Slowly, but slowly, it did get better. And now free education through high school is accessible to all. Discrepancies in education today are a complicated issue as well. CRT would say that schools in black neighborhoods are failing because of the racist system of education. But they fail to look at any other possible contributions to school differences, like a lack of school choice, funding going to pensions instead of education, one parent or zero parent, meaning grandparent-led homes, are just a few other examples of statistically proven reasons why some schools do not do as well as others. CRT would blame each one of those issues on lingering racism and acknowledge no personal responsibility by the students, parents, local schools, or the politics involved, which all affect how an individual school performs. So these things we just looked at are just a few arguments that you will hear over and over again about why America is racist at its foundations. Do the research yourself and don't believe all the modern historians with an anti-American agenda. We do have a checkered past, but we also have much to be proud of. We also must be aware that past injustices may still have lingering effects in our nation. If we see racist practices, we must speak. We must be willing to gather the evidence and examine claims and evaluate the truth. We must be sensitive to those who believe differently, discussing the evidence on both sides rationally without accusation or patronization. We must speak the truth in love, and we must seek to value relationships over political and cultural ideas. But we also must see CRT for what it is, a Marxist-based, anti-God ideology bent on destroying Western and American culture and dividing as many of us as possible. So now you know a little bit about the origins of CRT and why it's attacking our history. Pastor Bob is going to get into the nitty-gritty of the worldview of CRT.
Thank you, Anna Marie. I really appreciate just being able to just be reminded of my history and where our nation has come from. It's something that I'm very appreciative of. I'm very thankful to be born in America and to be born during this time and to know where we came from to where we're at today. And I believe that this is just nothing more than just another challenge that is being thrown at the church to say for us to rise up and to expand the kingdom of God and to have Christ rule and reign here on the earth today. So, as Anna Marie stated very well, or stated this evening, I am looking to talk a little bit more about the differences between critical race theory or social justice, critical social justice theory, and a biblical worldview. I'm going to contrast the two. I'm going to look at a kind of as a philosophical way of looking at the worldview. Anytime that you evaluate a worldview, you need to ask some basic questions. One of the outcomes with a worldview, which Anna Marie described very, very well. What is a worldview? She described it very, very well for us, gives us good definitions. But one of the outcomes is that there's a dictionary that's used. And that dictionary will determine what the words will mean. And when you use a certain dictionary, because of the worldview that you have, it will impact the ideas and the belief systems that you have as a culture. So it's just not just a worldview, but there's this book that's there. Sometimes it is known, sometimes it is written, other times it is unwritten, that will determine how you are to believe and how you are to behave at times. I love what Bill Johnson says when he talks about the power of your words and the impact that your words can have. He says that your words can create worlds. And that's exactly what is being done with CRT. CRT is looking to create a new world, a new culture, a new society. And they're using words. A lot of times they are biblical words, they are Christian words, there are words that actually had good meanings and they had very solid traditional understandings that promoted people to be a good and moral people. They're taking it and they're twisting the meanings of them to become evil. So the things that we thought that were good are now becoming evil, and they are now wrong. They're becoming immoral, where at one point in time they were considered amoral. It was moral to be good. So if you just look about what's been going on around our culture today, I'll use some quick examples, even just like Black Lives Matter. All of us would look at it and say, of course Black lives matter. White lives matter. Chinese lives matter. Japanese lives matter. Indian lives matter. All lives matter. But to the CRT culture, Black Lives Matter has a unique definition to it, which I'm going to get into a little bit more next week. But it has a certain definition to it. The same thing when you talk about social justice. Social justice should be a good thing. For me, with social justice, it means that I love my neighbor. I love my enemy. I forgive. I try to do good towards them. I pray for my enemies. But that's not what they mean. They have a whole completely different meaning of what it is to be a social justice warrior. Another term that you hear a lot of is woke. When I think about woke, I think about being awakened to as to a new morning. That's sort of like the synonym, which is something new, a new idea. That's not what they're saying. Being woke has a whole different meaning. It means that all of a sudden you have come to a different reality, that the way that you're living now, Judeo-Christian values are wrong, and they are now considered immoral, that you have now become awakened to understand who you are and what class or what group of people you belong to, and it's the only group of people that you belong to. And the effects of being a part of that group of people then affects what goes on in culture and how you would behave and what you're supposed to do. So the language that you use will ultimately determine how you act and behave as a culture. It has a very large implication. So your worldview will determine at the very end the culture and how you'll be governed and how you'll live your life ultimately. And we can see that when we look at other nation cultures, whether it's what happened in the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or what's happened in Cambodia during the 1970s. Even today, dealing with what happened in Venezuela only just a short time ago. We can see how the world has changed and because of the worldview that was implemented into the society at the time. So, I'm going to compare social justice or critical race theory with a biblical worldview. So when I do that, I'm going to address 4 questions, big overarching questions. When you're looking at a philosophy or a worldview, you look at these 4 questions. There's a couple other ones, but these are the 4 main ones that you're going to look at to evaluate where they come from and what are the answers to the question. So I'm going to first start with what CRT says is the answer to these questions, and then I'm going to back it up to what a biblical worldview. What does the Bible say about it? What is it that Christians believe about the answers to this question? So to begin with, we have to start at the very beginning. It's kind of a foundational question, a foundational understanding. We need to answer what is ultimately real? What is ultimate reality, and where does it come from? The CRT worldview says that it is the human mind that defines what is ultimately real. That defines the reality. Everything is created here within the human mind. It's where it begins. So rather than be grounded in a God of the universe, they're grounded in nothing except what you can think, what you imagine at times, what you emotionally are feeling. So they have no reality of a God. It's not grounded in any kind of God. And it's not even grounded in the material universe with its natural laws. So they even have beliefs that defy even the natural laws. And you see this within the LGBT plus community. They defy even the natural laws and the natural order. So rather than be grounded there, everything is grounded within the human mind. The American social theorist Jeremy Rifkin, he captures it very well. I'm just going to read this quote here from him. It says, "We no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home, and therefore are obliged to make our behavior conform with a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. We make the rules. We establish the parameters of reality. We create the world, and because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behavior, for we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible for nothing outside of ourselves, for we are the kingdom, the power, and the glory." Rifkin here uses religious terminology, and I think he does so rightly, because it is an actual belief system. It is a religious system. If you look at the root word of culture, it starts with the word cult, and cult means religion. It means a belief system. And in their belief system, there is no God that we're answerable to. There is no natural law that we must conform to. We create the reality. We are God. These are the fundamental philosophical beliefs of CRT. So to me, it reminds me of when the children of Israel, during the time of the judges, and it is written in Judges 17, in those days there was no king in Israel, Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's exactly what we're seeing today within the culture with CRT. They're only going to do what they think is right. Each person's going to do their own thing, and that they're not going to have anything that's going to be subjected to any kind of God. We're living in those very similar days. So what is the biblical worldview of what is ultimately real? The biblical worldview says that the God of Genesis 1:1 defines the ultimate reality. In the beginning, God. He created the heavens and the earth. Nothing exists or makes sense apart from him. The Apostle Paul in the book of Colossians, chapter 1, 16 and 17 says, "For in him all things were created, things in the heaven and on the earth, invisible and visible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things are held together." That is where we have our foundation. That's where our understanding of where reality begins. It's within God. It's outside of ourselves. It is in the Creator God himself. The second question that we have to answer when we're evaluating different philosophies and worldviews is, who are we? The critical race theorist will say that we're creatures whose identity is wholly socially determined. We are a product of our race, sex, and gender identity. There is no shared human nature. We're not part of the human culture or human society. We're not all one. We're not part of the whole group of humanity. There is no, with a more radical understanding, is that there is no individual. Our identity is entirely socially constructed. There is no individual person. One of the presuppositions with CRT is that it doesn't matter what your personal history is, your life experiences, or your choices, or any kind of deeply held beliefs. They do not matter. The only thing that matters is, when you define your identity, is what group you are a part of. What group or groups do you affiliate with? Therefore, your individual freedoms, responsibility, and accountability all become casualties of this destructive, dehumanizing belief. In a biblical worldview, we answer the question, who are we? As creations and image bearers of a good and holy and loving God, who are with inherent dignity and immeasurable worth. In contrast, the Bible affirms the importance of every individual. Individuals matter. All lives matter. It doesn't matter what group you're associated with or who you are. It doesn't matter what race you come from. Every individual matters. Throughout history, we can look throughout all time, whether biblical history, even American history, we can see where God raised up an individual to change the course of humanity, to change the course of human history for the better. In the Bible, we can see that God raised up Abraham, Moses, Ruth, Elijah, Jesus, Peter, John, Lydia, Esther, and many, many more. In our own American history, we can see where God raised up George Washington to lead during the Revolution, and Jefferson. You can see where God raised up Abraham Lincoln during the time of the Civil War. We can see that during the times of slavery, we had Thaddeus Stevens and we have Harriet Tubman working the Underground Railroad, freeing slaves from the South to the North. In World War II, we had Winston Churchill. And during the Civil Rights Movement, we had Rosa Parks, who stood up, and Martin Luther King Jr. Another important thing is how we look with a biblical worldview is that of understanding who we are is that our choices matter. God holds us individually accountable to our belief and to our actions. It's not just because I'm a part of a group that matters. It's that my actions individually matters. It doesn't matter what race I come from or what group of people I identify myself with. I individually am responsible for the decisions I make and for my own behavior. Our identity then comes from the truth, the bedrock truth found in our common creation in God's image and likeness with equal value and dignity. The thing is within CRT and critical social justice, there will never be a unity in the world with this belief system. It can only divide as it has no basis for unity. It will only segregate us into competing tribes pitted against each other in an endless power struggle. Only Christ can bring reconciliation among humanity through the cross of Jesus Christ. It's only through his blood that we are reconciled between God and man and between one another. CRT will never do that for us. It will only divide one group with another. The third question you have to ask when you're looking at worldviews is that what is our fundamental problem as human beings? The CRT worldview would say that it's oppression, and specifically the oppression of a white, heterosexual male. And even to get more specific, it's a Christian, white, heterosexual male. And the reason is because they believe that we have established and we maintain a hegemonic power structure to oppress and subjugate women, people of color, and sexual minorities like the LGBT community and others. So just to let you give you a definition of what hegemonic means, or hegemony. It means leadership in its positive sense. In the negative sense, it means dominance. It means one country over another, or it means one social group that is overruling another. A great example is the caste system in India, where you have different systems, like the high class in India, high caste in India is the Brahmas, and the lower class is the Dalits, which is the slave, and they are the lowlies. That's where hegemony comes into play. So CRT answer is here clearly is oppression. They do not believe that evil actually begins in the human heart. They believe that it's part of a social group or some group that you belong to, but it actually starts here in the human heart. So CRT divides the world into oppressors and victims, and it gives way to the concept of intersectionality. Anna Marie gave a great definition of understanding what intersectionality is, but is basically, just for review, it's depending on the different groups that you associate with, that you are victimized or that you are oppressed by. The more that you can check the boxes off, the more that you can say that I'm a victim of, the greater your oppression. And the unique thing about it is that the more that you are oppressed in the eyes of CRT, it's like you have more clout. It's like you have a bigger voice. It's like you have a stronger, more power in that world than anyone else. So the goal is basically to check off as many boxes as you can, to be a part of as many groups as you can, because it gives you a super identity almost. It gives you that extra power or influence more than what you could if you're only part of one or two. So the problem is that the more that you can draw the good versus evil line between the different groups, it's easier to dehumanize the perceived evil group. So it's sort of what's happened in Germany during World War II with Nazism. So for a little bit of while, it was the anti-Semitism was kind of very basic in the Jewish community, but it got heavier and stronger. It became more powerful within the culture. And so it wasn't just that we just didn't like you Jews and pushed you aside. It got to the point where you didn't shop at them. You didn't do any type of commerce with them. Till it got to the point where you started to wear a star, and you had a star put inside your shop saying that I'm a Jewish shop, don't shop here. And to the point where the Nazis came in and loaded them onto cars and sent them, rail cars, and sent them off to concentration camps and killed 6 million of them or more. That's how easy it was. The line was drawn, and it was propagated throughout the government into the culture to say that Jews were wrong, and Jews eventually became evil. Just because they were part of the Jewish culture, or the Jewish race, they were considered evil. And it got to the point where all the culture was a part of it, and the belief system was then stuck even within the church, and the church even propagated it and did not stand up against the evil that was going on against the Jewish people in Germany and throughout Europe. So CRT will destroy the civil and humane society, and it will replace it with hatred, division, and tribalism. And that's exactly what we're seeing today if we look across the landscape of our nation. We see nothing but upheaval, and we see division everywhere that we look. So in a biblical worldview, how do we address the problem of what is the fundamental human problem with what's going on in our humanity? We say that it's rebellion. In Romans, it says that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Our rebellion against God has resulted in broken relationships between God and between man and his fellow man, and between man and the creation. Alexander Stolzen, who was a political prisoner in Russia during the whole time during communism back in the 60s and stuff, I think he died in like 2004. But he says that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties. And I would even say it doesn't draw the line between races or between gender or between or races or anything else. But it goes between, it falls right through every human heart. The line is drawn through every human heart. That is where evil comes from. Every problem we face, every evil thing that comes about within our culture comes from a deep spring of rebellion and alienation from God. So, the last question we look at when we're evaluating biblical or evaluating worldviews or philosophies is, what is the solution to our problem? In a CRT world, in a critical social justice world, it's revolution. Oppressed victims and their allies must unite in an intersectional coalition to unmask, deconstruct, and overthrow these oppressive power structures and systems and institutions. These social justice champions of today are not seeking a peaceful social transition that begins with an inward heart of repentance. They want nothing less than revolution. And the revolution that they champion is patterned after the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, with what they did during the time of Mao. And all of these revolutions, they ended in two things: bloodshed and destruction, both of property and of the culture. Completely obliterated it. They want to destroy the traditional and Western cultural norms that often are based on Christianity to make room for the new, which is really nothing more than just the repackaged old. It's Marxism. One of the things that I always ask when I'm in conversation with someone that's trying to convince me of this type of worldview, of either critical race theory, I always ask them, so what is it that you're replacing it with? What are you replacing it that's going to bring about a better life than what I have right now? Or a better life of where you are as a victim? How is your life going to change with this new system? How is your division, how is your destruction going to bring about a positive change and transform the culture into the utopia that you want to propagate and that you think is going to happen? I never get a good answer for that. They just say it has to be done. Unfortunately, you can see this, how this is beginning to infiltrate all different spheres of our society and our culture today. A lot of times you'll hear things like compulsory re-education. You say you have to be re-educated. Then there's indoctrination that has to happen, a lot of times under the disguise of diversity training or sensitivity training. You've heard a lot of that with the corporate world where they're bringing in whole people from the outside as consultants to say we need to have this sensitivity training, which is nothing more than critical race theory. A lot of times you'll see where people, depending on if they're part of that worldview, the critical race theory worldview, they come with you with contempt. Sometimes they'll threaten you. They'll shame you. A lot of times they will silence you. We see that a lot on social media, where people are being silenced because of their opinion. A lot of times you'll see people of prominence are being canceled. You hear that a lot, the cancel culture. Basically, that means that you have voice doesn't count, it doesn't matter. And so they shut you down every way that they can so that their message cannot be heard over the critical race theory message. Perhaps one of the most common ways and tactics of being able to try to hurt us in and help us force us into the critical race theory worldview is political correctness. Political correctness is supposed to shield the oppressed and inflict penalties on the violators. I have a very simple example. This happened this week. I was talking to someone at Giant, and I didn't know it, but I used the wrong pronouns. Here, pronouns are offensive now to people if you don't use the proper one. Apparently, I used the wrong pronoun. I did not know that. I could not tell. I could not tell that this person I was using the wrong pronouns. I assumed I was using the proper pronouns. But I was called on it and said that you must call me such and such. It was a he, her, she, her. And I needed to call her by those pronouns and not something else, although I was assuming that this person was of the opposite gender due to dress and how they looked. I was called in public about it and corrected in public. I apologized and moved on, but I did not apologize that I offended her, but I still believe that I was correct in what I was seeing. And I thought I used the proper pronouns, but apparently I didn't. But this is where they're at. They will, even in public, do that. So with CRT, there is no compromise. There is no live, let live. There's no tolerance. There's no win-win scenario. There is no forgiveness of grace. There is no love your enemy. There is no get the log out of your own eye first so you can help the other person. There is only grievance and condemnation and retribution. There are only bigots, haters, and oppressors that must be destroyed. So what's the biblical worldview to this answer to this question? What is the solution to our problem? The biblical worldview is that it's the gospel of Jesus Christ. On the cross, God incarnate bore the punishment we deserved for the sinful rebellion in order to show us a mercy we could never deserve. His death on the cross and his resurrection opened a way for the reconciliation for all of our broken relationships. Those are the biblical worldview. I must say we're in agreement with this critical race theory, that there is a problem with our societies. They are broken. And they need to be transformed, and they need to be changed. The problem I have with it is the way we are going about doing it. I believe that first, the root problem has to be addressed and understanding. It's a relationship between God. This is what has been broken. If this isn't restored first within your life individually, there is no lasting societal change that can come from that. Sure, there is injustices in society because we're a fallen, sinful, and a very selfish people. But a biblical societal change is an inside-out process that begins with an inward transformation. Ezekiel, in chapter 36, verse 26, it says that I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you a heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. It has to be that type of a transformation that happens first and foremost before we'll ever see society being changed. You and I as an individual must have that change of heart that is no longer hard and cold towards one another and between God. We have to have that restoration, and it has to start from transforming inside us as an individual. From that point, then, our societies, our groups, the people that we associate with, then society is then changed. I'll close here with what Bill Johnson says, a friend of mine from out in West California. I love what he says when he talks about how do you transform nations. He says, first transformed lives transforms families. Then transformed families transform the city. Transformed cities transform the nations. Although tonight this topic has been very heavy, and it's very sobering to understand where we're at today as a culture and as a nation, but I believe it's a warning sign for us to begin to stand up and to arise and to begin to declare the gospel of Jesus Christ is the hope for the nations. It's the hope for the nation. It's the hope for the individual. It's the hope for those who are the downtrodden, to those who are lost, those who are trapped in sin, those who don't have a hope. But we have the answer, and it's Jesus Christ.